Hey, welcome back to the Pomegranate Salon. Here we are outside of my tent, and I want to tell you why I'm bringing you this message today from the tent on the patio. I thought of the book that I read probably 20 years ago called The Red Tent by Anita Diamant. In this book, it's written around the time of, it's about Bible times, the Hebrew people. I think the patriarch was Jacob, or one of the 12, one of the sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel. Anyway, what I remember was the reason why it was called the Red Tent is because once a month, when all the women were deemed impure because they were having their menstruation, they would be banished from the community so that they wouldn't make the men unclean, and they would go and be together in this tent outside of the camp of the rest of everybody else. And but it was a time that they loved. It was a time that they had fun together, they ate good food, they didn't have to do work, they just enjoyed being on their periods together. They told stories that the men didn't get to hear, and there was something sacred and juicy and special about that time that I certainly wish I had experienced as a young woman. So I realized that that is what my goal is with this channel, and the work that I'm doing is to create a 21st century virtual red tent for you to be a part of. So I thought I would start a little bit today, inviting you in, of course, to check this out. A few things I want to say as we kind of get going in this is that I know this isn't going to be for everybody. So if you were brought here, if you landed here, I think that it's likely that there is a divine reason that you were brought to this place. Secondly, my experience comes from the Christian faith. I grew up in conservative evangelical Christianity, and I was raised Baptist, and I know that a lot of the things that I want to talk about resonate with lots of people. So I don't want to say that my experience is strictly, or the things I'm going to talk about are strictly for people who were raised in evangelical Christianity. I know that there are a lot of themes that run through conservative religious traditions that we all can kind of understand because they're universal elements of what it has meant to grow up female in conservative religious traditions. I'm going to be speaking from my own experience and my own research. I'll give you a little bit more of my background. I always loved church. I always loved God, but I always as a kid felt like something is missing in this story. Like in the church that I grew up in, we talked a lot about Jesus. We talked a lot about God. You know, we believed, and we would say we believed in the Trinity, but the Holy Spirit aspect was just rarely talked about. And I always felt like it didn't make any sense to me that only men could be pastors or spiritual leaders. Like, God doesn't really not give you gifts based off of if you do or don't have a penis. That just did not seem to me like the way that it went. And I never actually became a full member of that church because I just always felt like something is just not right here. While there was that side of me, there was also like church loving Emily. So I was at church at least 2 days a week. I did everything: youth group, choir, taught children's church, helped in the nursery, was at every vacation Bible school, every event. I was very, very involved. Church and that aspect of community was a really, really big part of my life, and still is something that is very special and meaningful for me to have community. When I went to college, I studied intercultural religious studies, and I was a fish out of water in some ways. I was really excited to learn more about some kind of fringe theologies like liberation theology, some aspects of God's preferential option for the poor, as some people read the Bible. I fell in love with this radical aspect of Jesus this guy who stood up to the establishment. And I also was a little bit mad that it had taken 20 years for me to meet that dude when I had been going to church every, like, twice a week for all of my life. So, learning more about those things, I also started to learn a little bit more about feminist theology and the place and the role of the divine feminine within spirituality as a whole, Judaism, and also within Christianity, because there's a lot of mysticism, a strong tradition of mysticism within Christianity that I would say modern evangelical Protestant Christianity doesn't really know what to do with. It's not dogmatic. It doesn't fit in a little box. And so a lot of the teachers want to just put that to the side. Like, let's not talk about it. I also am like a very reluctant sex ed teacher, I guess you could say, which is a little bit of what I feel like I'm doing here. And I want to tell you some of that story too. I grew up in an environment in the 90s when I came of age, so to speak. The really big thing was purity, sexual purity, abstinence, and a lot of evangelical churches like totally rallied around this idea of what it meant to save yourself for marriage. I was given a promise ring, well, what was it called? An abstinence ring by my mom and dad on my 16th birthday with a pledge to keep myself sexually pure and save myself for marriage. All the education that I ever received around sex and sexuality was really about abstinence. I remember lots of times that the story was like, don't make yourself too sexy, like be an attractive young woman, but don't be too sexy because you don't want the boys to sin. So all this onus was really on the young woman to be moderating and her sexuality, her eros energy, and to not have too much, but don't have too little. Like, find some sort of hard to hold middle ground with all of that with your. So off I go through college. I dated a little bit in high school, but really nothing much. I never had a boyfriend. I go to college. I go to this Christian university where there definitely was a lot of focus on getting your MRS degree, and I did not know how to flirt. I thought that maybe being like intellectual was going to be the way that some man would love me for my mind and not my body. Big shocker, that didn't work too well. So I graduate college. I've never had a boyfriend. So at this point, right, I'm like the poster child for doing the abstinence thing really super well. And so I go to Africa. As a graduate, I volunteered in Zambia for a year, and I was in a little village, and I was volunteered by the villagers to be the sex ed teacher, because why not? And because I was, and still am, a person that's like, okay, if that's what you need, then I will do it. I went for it. I found it totally hilarious that I was the person that was teaching sex ed to the adult men and women at the local Bible college who had many children, who knew a lot more about sex experientially than I did, but maybe didn't know as much about contraception as was readily available information in the West, in the United States. And I also ended up being the local sex ed teacher for the middle school girls, and that was something that I just brushed up on things and took that opportunity to talk as much as I could about basic biology. And I felt at that point like if that message of me being the person who could speak about the taboos that nobody else in the village felt like they could talk about, if I saved one person from getting HIV because they understood what a condom was and how to use it, then totally great. Years later, I go see an astrologist, and I was just really curious about what my star chart would look like and how somebody would interpret that. It was the first time that had ever happened, that I'd ever had anybody read my chart. And the gentleman who did it was looking at my chart and said, there's really something here about taboos. What I now know is that I have some definite activity for my chart in my 5th house, and that is the house that's ruled by Scorpio, and there's a lot of energy that's about going into the depths, talking about the things that want to be hidden, being that person to kind of like talk about that, and that lines up with what in my chart looks like my work, what I'm here to do. At the time, I found that fascinating, that there was something there that connected to this other work that I had done. And then fast forward years later, I'm working at a school and we need to have a Title IX coordinator. So if you're not familiar with Title IX is a law passed in the 70s that was supposed to make athletics more even playing field for men and women to both have access to sports. What that also turned into eventually was that men and women need to be granted equal access to education in the classroom, and if there are any mitigating factors that affect that, then those need to be dealt with by the administration or by law. So what that looked like is aspects of sexual harassment or discrimination based on sex or gender or sexual orientation. And the school said, okay, this is, you need to do this. And I really was like, please no. That just seems scary, and I don't want to have to be that person that does that, but I did not have a choice. As we joked, I said, I was voluntold that this was my new job. So I took it on, and I learned a ton, but a part of that was having to get really comfortable talking with all of the students about aspects of sexuality, sex, really this like protocols of engaging in sexual relationships, learning how to understand when a yes is a yes and a no is a no, and some of these nuances where I feel like our culture got really good at teaching basic biology of sex, but not the aspects of insightful, intuitive interacting and in an intimate sexual encounter. And that's why we have a lot of people who are experiencing non-consensual sex, or aspects that were non-consensual on a sexual continuum, and those can be very damaging. So this is another aspect of where I did not seek these things out. They just kind of ended up in my lap. In the last year, I've done a lot more of my own digging in and research about a little bit more focused on healthy, shame and guilt-free sexuality for women, aspects of some of the mechanics of women's sexuality and how they're different from men. And that's been born out of my own need to do that. But I realized that this is the piece that I can also share with the women who, like me, grew up in similar circumstances and want to discover what more there is for them. Because that to me is life lived in the image of God. A full, luscious, juicy, lavish life. One that includes a vibrant sexuality, and that's what I want for you. So I'd love to hear what you want, what I can offer you, and how I can support you, because that, I feel pretty strongly, is my mission and what I'm here to do.